Before the break, we spoke about the things that are in this package, this stimulus package that people will be getting vis-a-vis the $900 billion. Well, they may be putting the final touches on it is Congress, but there is certainly a glaring omission that will not be in this. There's no money for states that are already dealing with massive holes in their budgets. All 50 currently considering budget and service cuts and deep ones as we speak. Businesses, they're closing, which means huge shortfalls when it comes to sales and payroll taxes. People, they're out of work, so they're not spending money or taking the train, basically buying anything. That means a lot less tax money coming in and seas of red ink from the states themselves. In fact, Moody's now estimates that the total of all 50 state budget deficits this year is close to $1 trillion. That's with a T. That's money states need to make up, whether they get it from Washington or they then be forced to raise taxes or slash desperately needed services. And few services would be left untouched. I'm talking including the essentials. That would likely mean you'll have fewer cops on the streets, firefighters fighting fires would be cut, paramedics responding to emergencies in the middle of a pandemic, and even teachers in classrooms. Don't forget, public hospitals, they have borne the brunt of COVID cases in many places, and they rely on state aid to keep the staff working, medicines coming, and just to keep the lights on. They too, however, could be seeing funding cuts and staff cuts without state aid. Now, the biggest hits could come to public transportation across our country. Every city in the country seeing the budgets for transit systems decimated as people stay home instead of riding the trains or buses to work. That means revenues, they've been slashed, so massive service cuts are going to be needed unless they get buckets full of federal cash. As an example, Atlanta, they've already suspended more than a third of its bus lines. Boston, they're warning they could end weekend service on rail lines and shut down the city's ferries entirely. And New York City's transit system just unveiled a doomsday plan that would reduce subway service by 40% and commuter rail service in half. And the state itself staring down a budget deficit of roughly $15 billion and counting. Andrew, he recently spoke with the man responsible for balancing the books, New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli.
To be fair, New York has, in the recent past, been carrying regular, almost systemic deficits that had to be reconciled every year. It was $6 billion last year, projected to be somewhere between $6 and $8 billion this year. Obviously, COVID has cost the state far, far more. But is the state asking the federal government to pay part of that tab as well?
No. Look, you're absolutely right. We always point out the fact that we have a structural budget gap. One of the big concerns I've identified as controller year after year is that while we get our budget in balance for the coming year, we always start the next year with a gap. So there's no doubt about that. But we meaning the legislature and the governor, they deal with the gap at the beginning of the year. I wish there would be long-term adjustments so we don't have the out-year gaps. But the tens of billions in lost revenue that we're talking about has nothing to do with structural budget gap. It has to do with the lack of revenue because the economy being put on hold. And it's important to point out, this is not a New York-only issue. States all across this country, even red states, are having many of the same budget issues that we're having. We're not asking for something unique only for New York. We just want to recognize that states need to be made whole. If the state has a huge hole in our budget, what is going to be the answer? Increased taxes, revenue raisers, or more borrowing? And we already are a heavily indebted state. So those options, frankly, none of them are acceptable. We may end up with some combination of the three. The only solution for now, though, in the short run, is to get more help from Washington, D.C. And that is also key for the MTA. And when you talk about having our economy recover for the New York metro region, we need the MTA, the trains and the subways and the buses to be financially solvent, to have adequate schedules, and to have safe conditions so that workers will feel confident that they can go back to using public transit as part of the returning to the workplace. And obviously that's something that's very much tied to the financial solvency of the MTA. We don't want to see severe service cuts there or dramatic increases in tolls and fares. So it does come back to Washington. Can't avoid that.
Can you give us a specific idea of what might get cut and how much so that people can get a sense of what the impact of this could be?
Well, again, the final decision on this obviously is in the purview of the governor in the first instance, because under the state budget, the governor was given through the Division of Budget extraordinary power to reduce budget allocations that were part of the state budget. The state legislature would then have 10 days to substitute any cuts with their own plan. So, these are policy choices we don't make in the comptroller's office, but that the legislature and the governor would ultimately work out. The governor has identified about $1.6 billion in cuts to state agencies, about $8.2 billion in cuts in local assistance, and that's money for school districts, for counties, towns, villages, municipalities. The governor laid out early on that this could equate to about a 20% across the board cut. So they haven't spelled out more detail than that, but I think it would be fair to say if the maximum of that over $8 billion in cuts, in fact, would have to be implemented, you'd be talking about across the board cuts. And that would be school aid, that would be cuts in healthcare, senior programs, certainly local assistance, AIM funding for our municipalities. I don't think that, if you're going to have cut of that magnitude, there'd be too many programs that wouldn't be affected in some way. The details would still to be determined. And part of what's happening is that we're managing cash flow at the state level. Division of Budget is doing that by withholding certain payments, over $2 billion in payments. Again, much of it to localities, municipalities and school districts, some to nonprofits that have contracts with the state. They have been held back, deferred. That could translate into permanent cuts. Again, if we don't see more help from Washington, or we don't see a rapid improvement in the economy. And I think it'd be fair to say, while we're seeing some recovery in the economy, it is a slow recovery. And so again, the federal government just has revenue resources that we don't have at the state or local level. We've appreciated the help thus far, but much of the help has really been tied to reimbursement for expenses related to COVID-19 and the response to it. We need help to deal with how to repair the economic damage, the revenue loss that as a consequence of COVID-19.
As you suggested, some of these possible cuts would be somewhat self-defeating. If you cut funding to hospitals, you risk a spike in the virus. That hurts the state even more. You cut police, crime rises, people leave. That hurts even more. You mentioned the MTA. You cut that. That's going to stymie the economic recovery. If the state has to make those cuts, how does New York ever get out of this hole?
Well, that's an important question. And the clear answer is we're not going to get out of it very easily. And as I said earlier, the options are bleak. If it's cuts in programs, and I suspect they would be severe cuts. It's raising taxes at a time that we're having many challenges with the economy, and in the middle of this, to come up with a thoughtful tax policy, I have my own doubts about that. Or going even more into debt. And we went into this pandemic already more in debt than we should have been, from my point of view. We've done about $4.5 billion in extraordinary borrowing, again, that was authorized as part of the state budget agreement this year, again, to basically keep us afloat. But that $4.5 billion is supposed to be paid back within this fiscal year. So if we have to go into long-term deficit borrowing, that really sets back our finances and really obligates future generations of taxpayers in ways that really doesn't make sense.
You mentioned the possibility of raising taxes. What's your view on raising top-end taxes for the highest earners? The governor has been asked this throughout the COVID crisis. He's repeatedly refused to consider doing so. Should he be considering it?
God forbid. I'm not hoping for this, and I don't expect it. But what if we have a high infection rate again, and we have to close down the economy again, and the revenue shortfall is even worse than it is already? What that's going to mean is that all options are going to have to be on the table, and that's cuts, that's revenue raises, taxes, it's debt, or some combination thereof. What's most often talked about is an increased tax on higher income New Yorkers. The question always is, how do you define that? Obviously, we have an issue coming out of the federal tax changes and the cap on state and local tax deductibility. Where already we were starting to see some signs that some were changing their address out of New York to avoid some of the tax consequences. That's something you have to weigh very, very carefully. So look, at the end of the day, if worst case scenario plays out, I think the legislature and the governor are going to have to consider all options. But in the middle of this crisis, cuts would not be helpful. Raising taxes, generally speaking, when you're trying to get the economy moving again, would not be helpful, and more borrowing would not be helpful. Whether we can avoid any and all of that, I just don't know. And I also want to say, this budget challenge and the hangover from the economic damage of COVID-19, it's going to be with us for more than a year. You're talking about a multi-year challenge in dealing with this issue and keeping our budget in balance and providing services that people expect and continuing to spend more money on the response to COVID-19 and the public health emergency as well.
Our program is viewed around the country. I'm curious why someone from, let's say, rural Texas should care if New York and other blue states get federal assistance. What's the upside for them?
Well, I mean, the upside for all Americans is that a state like New York, and certainly the New York City metro region, is a huge contributor to the national gross domestic product. This is a generator of economic activity. You know, we put out our report on Wall Street, and that's actually one of the areas where there's been some positive news in terms of profits that are ultimately taxed, and higher earning individuals that contribute to the federal treasury as well as the state and local treasury. And New York continues to be one of a handful of states that sends more money to Washington in taxes than we get back in terms of federal aid. In fact, we're at the bottom of the list in terms of the net loss and that balance of payment. So, you know, a state like New York that is a giver, you know, to the federal treasury, that money then is spent and frankly distributed more generously to other states, it will hurt the national interest if a state like New York is on its knees financially, if a city like New York is on its knees. So, look, we need to keep in mind we're also all Americans. When other states have issues, and down in the South, they've had these terrible issues, you know, with storms and hurricanes, and in other parts of the country, the wildfires and so on. You know, New Yorkers don't say, well, they shouldn't get help, they should fend for it themselves. You know, we have to have a sense, again, of national unity, and New York needs to be, we're no better than anybody else, but we shouldn't be treated any worse than anybody else.
Tom DiNapoli is the Democratic Comptroller of the great state of New York. Mr. Comptroller, thanks so much for a few minutes. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And up next, we will head down to Georgia for a live report on the Senate runoff elections and also show you how Nate Silver from 538 is handicapping the races.